Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the borderlands of Kansas and the Indian Territory. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1895, a dry season that broke into sudden storms across the frontier plains. By then, the country was rebuilding from decades of conflict, but in the western reaches of Kansas, some communities remained far from peace. The Dalton name had already passed into whispers, not for glory, but for dread. In the official record, they were a family of train robbers cut down in a single day at Coffeyville. Yet, in several county ledgers and private letters discovered years later, there appears a curious footnote. 2 men of that same blood remained, restless, hidden, and vengeful. A retired deputy named Silas Trent, writing in his 1903 affidavit, mentioned a settlement outside Medicine Lodge, where travelers claimed to see 3 armed riders camped beneath the bluff. They were not ghosts, he wrote, but they had the stillness of men waiting for something to end. Their names were never confirmed, though townsfolk called them the other Daltons, cousins or brothers-in-law who slipped through the chaos after the gang's final raid. Old accounts in the Barber County Register tell of a sudden spate of disappearances that year: a freight handler, a ranch hand, and a preacher's son. Each vanished between May and July of 1895. No ransom, no witnesses, only the traces of campsites burned to ash and horse tracks leading toward the Gypsum Hills. The sheriff at the time, Edward Kellum, dismissed the fears as wandering drifters and misfortune. But in the archives of the county courthouse, one unsigned letter remains, dated August 11, 1895, sealed in a water-stained envelope. It reads, simply, "They've taken the faces of the dead, Sheriff. They ride with borrowed names." When historians later revisited this period, citing notes from the Dalton gang's surviving kin, they found fragments that didn't match the official story. 2 rifles registered to Cole Dalton and James Dalton surfaced in pawn records months after their supposed deaths. The ledgers were written in different hands, suggesting someone else had carried their arms southward, perhaps to Texas or deeper into Indian Territory. By autumn, ranchers began locking their barns before dusk. Women carried revolvers under shawls. The local telegraph operator, Miss Lillian Marsh, sent a final message before leaving town altogether. Sound carries strange after rain. Sometimes it's hooves, sometimes it's men calling by names we buried. No further mention of her appears in state records. Only her telegraph key was found, rusted, wrapped in cloth, and buried under a fallen telegraph pole along the Wichita Trail. By the winter of 1895, the settlement near Medicine Lodge had changed its rhythm. Livestock disappeared without trace, wagons were found abandoned on the trails, and families began to move eastward with little explanation. A blacksmith named Harlan Dokes noted in his account book that he was repairing horseshoes for strangers who would not give their names, but paid in silver dollars blackened with age. Those coins later tested as pre-1880 mint, bearing faint scratch marks, almost as if they had been buried and unearthed. County records from Comanche and Harper counties show a pattern of sightings: 3 to 5 riders, sometimes 2, moving together at night, carrying heavy satchels. Witnesses describe them as clean-faced but silent, as if they feared the sound of their own speech. By now, whispers tied them again to the Dalton bloodline, though few dared to speak it aloud. The memory of the Coffeyville raid, a botched double bank robbery in 1892 that left most of the Dalton gang dead, was still vivid. People said 1 or 2 had slipped away, hiding among sympathetic ranchers or half-forgotten relatives. In a February 1896 letter preserved in the Kansas State Historical Society, an itinerant preacher named Elijah Croft wrote, "They come through the plains like carrion birds before a storm. One wears a coat too fine for this place. The other's eyes are pale, watchful. They never sleep under the same roof twice." A few weeks later, a storehouse outside Coldwater was found looted. The doors were intact, but the contents, food, powder, and kerosene, were gone. Prints of horses and boots were visible, leading north to a stretch of broken hills that locals called the Wash. Sheriff Kellum organized a search, but turned back after 3 days due to flooding. Only one deputy, Henry Alcott, filed a written report, dated March 8, 1896. We found their camp. 3 bedrolls. One fire still warm. No men. Just a single mirror set upright against a stump, reflecting the rain. When the deputy returned the next morning with reinforcements, the camp had been stripped bare, ashes scattered, hoof marks covered with brush. It was as though the men had vanished in the night. Months later, newspaper clippings from the Wichita Eagle referenced an unclaimed bounty notice for unknown perpetrators operating between Medicine Lodge and Kiowa. The description matched that of the original Dalton men, though the dates did not align. The sheriff's office dismissed it as error. Yet, in a border tavern outside Woodward, Oklahoma, a farmer recalled overhearing a conversation that chilled him. They said Coffeyville was the lesson. This time, they wouldn't leave witnesses. In later interviews, this farmer, Jacob Hensley, swore he saw one of the riders remove his hat in the lamplight and reveal a scarred temple, identical to the injury documented in early photographs of Bob Dalton. Whether imagination or memory, the fear that followed kept most travelers off the southern trail for months. And still, the letters and ledgers continued to appear, small fragments of a story no one wanted to believe but could not quite erase. The spring of 1896 brought early rains across Kansas, washing out roads and revealing old traces long buried under dust. It was then that a surveyor named Thomas Grieg, working for the Santa Fe line, discovered a collapsed shack near the Bluff Creek Bend. The structure was hardly more than timber and corrugated tin, but inside, under a layer of damp hay, he found a set of county maps, ink blurred by water, and a folded sheet listing names. Among them were W. Harper, T. Boone, and R. Dalton. Grieg turned the findings over to the Barber County Marshal's office, where they sat unexamined for nearly a year. When they were finally logged, the clerk noted that the paper smelled of kerosene and horse sweat, as though carried on the trail for weeks. One entry, written in a hurried scrawl, read, "Never Coffeyville again. Too many eyes. South is safer." The official record, including the Dalton Gang Chronicle, stated clearly that the brothers perished in 1892, their bodies publicly displayed. Yet Grieg's discovery added to growing doubts whispered in taverns and churches that 2 men, perhaps kin, perhaps impostors, had kept the name alive through fresh crimes. Local folklore blurred fact and fear, suggesting that the remaining Daltons traveled by night, robbing small merchants or travelers too poor to be missed. An affidavit from Dr. Amos Ketch, a frontier physician, describes one of the few physical clues. He was called to tend a wounded man brought into his makeshift clinic near Kiowa in June 1896. The man gave no name, paid in coin, and demanded silence. Ketch wrote, "He bore an old bullet scar high on the left arm, healed years ago, but also a recent wound at the shoulder, powder burned close. His voice was even, educated. When I asked where he hailed from, he said, 'Coffeyville never ends, doctor. It just moves.'" By dawn the next day, the stranger had vanished, leaving behind only a blood-stained cloth and an empty revolver cylinder. Ketch turned over the items to the authorities, but no one claimed them. Meanwhile, more reports emerged along the Arkansas River corridor. Stage drivers missing, a telegraph cabin burned, and livestock shot rather than stolen. It was violence without purpose, echoing the chaos that followed the Dalton downfall years before. A constable's note from Harper County reads, "They are not robbing now, only reminding us they still ride." It is around this time that the name Dalton reappears in a ledger from a small pawn shop in Enid, Oklahoma territory. The entry lists 2 men, quiet demeanor, purchasing new revolvers, paying in gold dust. The handwriting trails off where the clerk's ink ran dry, leaving only a faint mark. When researchers later revisited the scene, drawing connections back to the surviving Dalton relatives, they noticed one unrecorded clue. The pattern of movement, north in spring, south in autumn, mirrored exactly the routes of the original gang's robberies documented in the Dalton Gang case files. The question that remained, whispered in both Kansas and Oklahoma, was never whether they existed, but whether they ever truly died at all. By the late summer of 1896, the towns along the southern Kansas line had developed a quiet ritual. Doors barred at sundown, lamps dimmed before midnight. No official curfew existed, yet no one stayed out. The Dalton name, once invoked by children in mock gunfights, now carried the weight of something spectral. In Medicine Lodge, a small hotel clerk named Peter Sloan kept a ledger where he noted every guest who passed through. In July of that year, he wrote a peculiar entry. 3 riders arrived past 10, paid in advance, refused rooms by the window. The tallest called himself Boone. The youngest spoke little, only asked for coffee. They left before dawn. Beds unslept, mud on the floorboards, the smell of metal and smoke. Weeks later, a freight wagon bound for Caldwell vanished with its driver, James Hutter, last seen on that same route. His belongings were recovered near a dried creek bed. His pocket watch stopped at 2:37. The wagon's wheel marks, traced by local ranchers, ended at the old Dalton crossing, a stretch of low ground used decades earlier by the original gang to move stolen horses. A local schoolteacher, Mrs. Clara Wynne, recalled hearing hoofbeats on consecutive nights, followed by hammering, as if someone were building or sealing something into the earth. When she mentioned it to her pupils, one child replied that his father had seen lights on the ridge, lanterns that didn't belong to miners. By autumn, the Kansas City Star published a brief notice. Unconfirmed reports of riders claiming the Dalton name persist across the frontier. Authorities warn against vigilante action. But vigilantes came anyway. A group of 7 ranchers, calling themselves the Fair Bluff Watch, rode south in September to trace the riders. Only 4 returned. Their leader, Samuel Brigg, refused to speak of what happened, but later confided to a local pastor that he'd seen a face I'd seen in newspapers years ago, only older, colder, and alive. Sheriff Kellum reopened his old files, consulting witnesses from the Coffeyville raid who had seen the bodies in 1892. He found discrepancies. One man recalled only 5 coffins, not 6. Another swore the youngest Dalton's face was covered before burial. Photographs from the aftermath, faded and grainy, offered no certain count. In an 1897 letter to the state marshal, Kellum wrote, "We've built our peace on the presumption of their death, but I fear some peace is counterfeit." Meanwhile, county correspondence indicates that telegrams sent between Medicine Lodge and Enid went unanswered for weeks at a time. Lines were cut, poles burned, and operators fled their posts. Through it all, the Dalton gang remained a cautionary echo in local sermons and newsprint, an emblem of lawlessness supposedly buried 3 years prior. Yet here it was again, resurfacing in fragment and rumor, as if the border itself refused to forget. The land kept its silence, the gullies filled and emptied with rain, and under that shifting soil, new secrets were beginning to surface. In early 1897, the thaw came late. Heavy snowmelt from the northern plains flooded the smaller rivers, washing loose the old banks near Bluff Creek. When the water receded, a ranch hand named Evan Pruitt stumbled upon a patch of disturbed earth, partially sunken, with shards of glass protruding through the mud. Curious, he dug a few inches and uncovered something that stopped him cold. A small metal locket, inside which was a faded photograph of 3 men in frontier coats. One bore a scar above the eye. Another had the sharp jawline unmistakably like Grat Dalton, known from the Dalton gang archives. Pruitt took it to the nearest marshal's station, where it was sealed as evidence and logged without comment. But the story spread faster than any official could contain. Locals began claiming that the Dalton brothers, or their kin, had built burial sites for those they'd robbed or silenced. No proof existed, only the locket and a patch of wet earth. A few weeks later, a letter surfaced in Arkansas City addressed to the Medicine Lodge Gazette. It was unsigned, but written in a steady, deliberate hand. The law counts graves, not ghosts. You'll find fewer of one than the other. The editor, Moses Reed, published it without endorsement, but the town took it as confession. Night patrols doubled. Men rode in pairs. Even the saloons closed earlier. Yet, in those same months, there came reports of strangers offering to sell gold coins of Dalton make. No such coinage ever existed, of course, but the very idea that the name could print its own currency showed how the legend had begun to distort itself. Deputy Henry Alcott, one of the few who had earlier investigated the campfire site at the Wash, was dispatched again to survey Bluff Creek. His official report, now brittle in the state archives, details a disturbing discovery. Found at least 3 depressions in the ground, each roughly man-sized. Soft earth, no visible remains. Detected faint odor of kerosene. Area appears recently disturbed, despite no nearby habitation. He noted that while the ground seemed newly dug, no tools or tracks remained, as if whoever had worked there had erased themselves. Alcott returned shaken, convinced someone was watching from the nearby timberline. His final note in the margin reads, "I heard whistling, 2 short, 1 long, the same as the Dalton signal in the Coffeyville reports." Within the month, Alcott resigned. By midsummer, the Gazette printed its last direct mention of the case, quoting Sheriff Kellum, "We will not chase ghosts through mud. The past is buried and will stay so." But as anyone in those border towns could tell you, the past in Kansas never stays buried long. And soon the ground itself would begin to betray the silence that men like Kellum worked so hard to maintain. The following autumn, 1897, was remembered for 2 things: relentless storms and the sudden silence of Bluff Creek Valley. Farmers began abandoning their plots, claiming the soil sank in places it shouldn't. Others swore they heard hammering at night near the old Dalton Trail, dull, rhythmic, and too measured to be thunder. A field hand named Ruthless, who lived on the outer ridge, recorded the most detailed account in his journal, later recovered from his widow's estate. "The rain's been constant for 6 nights. Between lightning cracks, I hear something striking iron. Once I saw a light move along the creek. Lanterns, maybe 3. Then came the smell of oil and earth turning over. When I went out at dawn, the ground was smooth, like it had been combed." Sheriff Kellum ignored such talk, insisting erosion had caused the disturbances. Yet by November, 2 new mounds had appeared beside the road to Kiowa, both perfectly shaped, without markers or prints. Travelers avoided the stretch entirely, claiming their horses refused to cross it. Meanwhile, reports filtered in from as far south as Ardmore, Indian Territory. 3 men fitting the Dalton description had traded horses there, leaving behind a blood-stained saddle and a silver spur marked RD. Locals remembered their silence, the way one of them limped and another never removed his gloves, even to eat. In December, the Topeka Herald ran a small article titled "The Dalton Resemblance, Fact or Phantasm?" quoting unnamed marshals who dismissed the claims as rural hysteria. Still, they quietly dispatched an investigator, Marshal Franklin Yates, to examine the reports. Yates's notes survive only in fragments, but one page stands out. "Found the locket from prior evidence now missing from storage. Clerk denies removal. 1 faint boot mark near the case. Square heel, non-regulation issue." He never filed a final report. By early 1898, the fear had spread beyond Kansas. Railway guards on the Santa Fe line began doubling patrols, and telegraph operators were instructed to report any interruption longer than 2 hours. Yet, in February, 3 consecutive nights passed without a single signal between Medicine Lodge and Woodward. When the lines were checked, the poles had been sawn clean through, not broken by wind. In a surviving dispatch from Deputy Waller, he notes, "No footprints, no wagon ruts, just the smell of smoke and the sound of wind carrying a man's laugh too far off to find." For decades afterward, locals would point to that silence as the moment the Dalton legacy crossed from crime into legend. The Dalton gang of history had been men, ambitious, reckless, mortal. But whatever lingered after 1895 moved differently, leaving no motive and no mercy. And so, through the soaked plains and sunken fields, the Dalton name became less a warning of robbers and more a rumor of the earth itself remembering. When the winter of 1898 gave way to a fragile spring, the town of Medicine Lodge tried to forget. The Gazette stopped printing Dalton stories, the sheriff's office burned old files to clear the record, and merchants along Main Street reopened with fresh coats of paint. But some things refused to vanish. The miller's wife, Abigail Trent, claimed her husband heard 3 sharp knocks at their door each night near midnight, always when the wind was still. He finally opened it on March 3rd. No one was there, but on the step lay a folded slip of paper. Written in soot, not ink, it read, "We ride still." 2 days later, Trent vanished. His wagon and horses were found 5 miles south, standing unharmed in a clearing. His coat was neatly folded on the seat, pockets emptied but untouched. Sheriff Kellum tried to suppress the panic by blaming river drifters and ordered the paper destroyed. Yet his own deputies recorded something stranger. One of them, Jonas Dwyer, wrote in his logbook, "The sheriff's boot print stopped before the creek. The others continued, deeper, as if someone heavier walked beside him." Within a month, Kellum himself resigned. The new acting sheriff, Walter Boone, came from Dodge City, a man reputed to have no patience for folklore. He reopened the case files, re-examined the surviving artifacts, and tried to map the Dalton sightings. His private notes, now stored in the Wichita archives, describe a meticulous if futile effort. Every claim traces to the same 2-month window, every route back to Bluff Creek. The only constant is rain. When the storms break, so do the sightings. When the ground dries, they return. That spring, a traveling photographer arrived from Topeka. He offered portraits to the townsfolk using one of the new glass plate cameras. On May 14th, he set up near the courthouse and took a group photo of local families. When the plate was developed, a shape appeared in the far background, 3 blurred figures on horseback, just beyond the frame of vision. Their faces were indistinct, but one seemed to wear a brimmed hat tilted low. Another had a hand lifted as if to shield from light. The image vanished after a few showings. The plate cracked and darkened overnight. The photographer, Elias Corbin, left town the next morning. He told the station master he was done with faces that don't stand still. After that, the towns along the southern border grew quiet again. For a while, it seemed as though the Dalton story had finally dissolved into dust. But in the diaries of that same year, and in the private letters now held at the state archives, the same phrase keeps returning, written by different hands, in different towns. They come when the rain begins. Whether it was a warning, a confession, or simply repetition born of fear, no one ever discovered. By mid-1898, the borders between Kansas and the Indian Territory had become a place where maps blurred as easily as memories. Travelers spoke of ghost towns, real towns, only emptied by fear. Wagons bypassed the Bluff Creek Road, and merchants refused to ship goods through the southern passes. Still, a handful of ranchers stayed behind, among them Eleanor Pike, a widow whose testimony would later prove pivotal. Her written account, preserved in the Barber County archives, begins simply. June 2nd, the sky was wrong, yellow before storm. I was bringing in the wash when I saw them. 3 riders, slow across the ridge, one turned to look my way. His face was pale as dust, and his eyes seemed fixed on something far behind me. That same evening, lightning struck near her barn, revealing 3 silhouettes standing near the tree line. By the time neighbors arrived, the rain had stopped and the ground was untouched. No hoofprints, no tracks. Only the smell of matches, one witness wrote. Around this time, Marshal Boone dispatched a small team to survey the valley. Among them was Deputy Alton Reeves, whose field notes survive in part. His writing is calm, precise, the kind of record kept by a man trying not to believe what he's seeing. Found remains of a campfire beside the creek, embers still warm. Tin cup on the ground, initials J.D. scratched along rim. Heard movement upriver. 3 horses. Gave chase. Lost them in fog. Later, returned to find cup gone. The initials, of course, echoed John Dalton, one of the gang's recorded members. Skeptics later claimed the evidence could have been planted, but Reeves insisted the cup was genuine. In an addendum dated July 3rd, he wrote, There are too many coincidences for coincidence. The Dalton gang may be dead, but something carries their shadow still. The marshal's report submitted to Topeka concluded that copycat riders, they were using the Dalton name to terrify isolated farms. But locals believed otherwise. In saloons and Sunday sermons, the same pattern surfaced. Strange whistling before storms, lantern lights seen at impossible distances, men calling each other by dead men's names. In one of the last newspaper mentions of the affair, the Caldwell Clarion printed an editorial titled Echoes of Coffeyville. It compared the present sightings to the violence of 1892, reminding readers that myth often grows where record ends. The Dalton legend, it wrote, was buried in photographs and left unguarded. Now the photographs seemed to move. That final line was prophetic. 2 months later, a traveling reporter from the Kansas Star claimed he'd seen an image of the outlaws displayed in a local saloon, a plate so old it had begun to fade. But as he described it, the faces looked sharper each night, clearer when the lamps dimmed. The saloon burned down 3 days later. No one saw who set it ablaze. The destruction of the Caldwell Saloon marked a turning point. The Dalton name, once only muttered in fear, now lingered in the ashes of a town that had run out of disbelief. The blaze drew marshals, railwaymen, and reporters alike, but by the time they arrived, the scene had already turned strange. Witnesses described the fire as too even, as though it had begun from within the walls, not from any single spark. When the embers cooled, investigators found fragments of glass plate, what remained of that infamous photograph. On its surface, faint outlines still clung, 3 faces, blurred and half erased. The emulsion bubbled from heat. One examiner, Dr. Francis Redd, noted in his statement, "These figures are not fully burned away. The reaction is uneven, as if the image resisted flame." A week later, Redd's office was burglarized. Only the broken plate was taken. Meanwhile, in the records of Marshal Boone, another report surfaced. A rancher named Micah Dyer claimed 3 strangers camped near his property, offering to trade old revolvers for silence. He described them as pale, mud-caked, and slow-spoken, with the weary calm of men long pursued. They said they were heading to Texas, Dyer testified, but their horses faced north. That same month, a telegraph operator in Kingman County, Earl Rowe, filed a peculiar maintenance report. While testing the night line after a thunderstorm, he received a short burst of Morse signal from an unknown source. It repeated one phrase, "Never Coffeyville again." Rowe logged the incident, believing it a prank, until he realized the line beyond Bluff Creek had been severed since the last storm. The incident spread quietly among railway crews, who began refusing to travel at night. Their superstition wasn't baseless. By September, 2 freight wagons and 1 telegraph carriage vanished between Medicine Lodge and Kiowa. The wreckage of one was later found in a dry arroyo. No bodies, no horses, but the ground bore deep impressions of boots in a perfect circle around the overturned wagon. In his private journal, Boone finally wrote what no marshal would print. "I cannot disprove their survival, nor prove their deaths. The Dalton gang belongs to no man's jurisdiction now." By 1899, the fear had reached neighboring territories. Oklahoma lawmen reported bands of nameless riders moving under storm clouds, vanishing as rain began. It was always the same number, 3, always the same silence. And when lightning struck over the open plains, witnesses said it illuminated not ghosts, but men, real, breathing men, faces hard and familiar, carrying the old marks of the Dalton name. The line between history and haunting had blurred beyond repair, and the land, soaked with years of rumor and rain, seemed to remember what the records had tried to forget. As 1899 drew to a close, the towns scattered along the southern Kansas border found themselves living in 2 realities. In the official one, newspaper, record, and law, the Dalton gang had died 7 years earlier in Coffeyville, buried, photographed, and forgotten. In the other, the one that hung in barns, kitchens, and the sleepless corners of local taverns, they were still alive, moving unseen, riding the edge between rain and dusk. The new year began with a series of fires that defied explanation. Small barns, haylofts, even a telegraph hut near Coldwater, each found charred overnight. The flames never spread, never touched the nearby grass. The smell of kerosene was always present, but no containers were recovered. Sheriff Boone, exhausted and nearing retirement, described it in his final entry. The fires burn only where the Dalton name was last spoken. No thunder, no wind, just that sound of striking metal, like the echo of a shovel. It was that sound that haunted the townsfolk. Several claimed to hear it after heavy storms. Metal on soil, deliberate and slow. One farmer, Isaac Merrow, told a reporter from the Topeka Ledger, "They dig, sir. I don't know for what, but they dig. You can hear it when the ground is wet. If you shout, it stops." Then came the discovery that reignited the legend completely. In March of 1900, a railway maintenance crew repairing a culvert near Kiowa Creek unearthed a wooden crate sealed with pitch. Inside were 3 revolvers, their barrels rusted but intact, each engraved with a single initial, B, G, and R. The R was of particular note. It matched the markings documented on Bob Dalton's revolver, listed among evidence from Coffeyville, but officially destroyed years earlier. Marshall Boone was gone by then, dead of pneumonia that spring, but his successor, Edgar Millen, reopened the inquiry. Millen sent the revolvers to the state lab in Topeka, where an aging clerk noted in his inspection, "All 3 weapons show signs of recent firing, powder fresh, residue oily. But these guns have lain in the earth longer than any man can say." That report was quietly filed away and never cited again. Yet the case didn't die. A traveling salesman named Charles Reamer, passing through Bluff Creek, later told a story to a local minister. "I saw them plain as day, 3 riders on the hill before the rain came. One raised a hand, not in greeting but warning. The other 2 just watched. Then lightning hit, and they were gone." The minister recorded the account, then burned it, saying, "Some storms aren't meant to be told." By the summer of 1900, what had begun as whispers turned to ritual. Locals began leaving lanterns unlit during storms, claiming light drew them near. The Dalton name was no longer a legend of crime. It had become a pattern of weather, an omen, something stitched into the rhythm of rain itself. And even as the century turned, no one dared to say the name aloud after dark. The first decade of the new century began quietly. Progress was the new faith. Railways expanded, telegraphs multiplied, and Kansas began to think itself civilized. Yet beneath the surface of every new track and depot ran the unburied pulse of an older fear. The Dalton legend, thought to have died with the century, stirred again, this time in ink. In 1902, a schoolteacher named Jonas Lyle published a small booklet titled "Frontier Phantoms: True Accounts of the Southern Plains." Among its tales was a chapter labeled simply "The Dalton Return." He cited unnamed letters, eyewitnesses, and a recovered diary belonging to an itinerant peddler. The diary's passage, written in uneven script, read, "3 men camped near my wagon. They spoke of roads as if they were alive. The road remembers," one said. "When they rose to leave, they left no tracks." Lyle's pamphlet sold well for a few months, then abruptly vanished from shelves. The printer claimed the plates had been misplaced during a move. Only 2 copies are known to survive today, both missing the final pages. Meanwhile, in Medicine Lodge, townsfolk noted another pattern. Each spring, as the rains returned, shallow trenches appeared overnight in the fields near the old Dalton crossing. No one saw who dug them, but the ground bore strange indentations, as if objects had been buried, then unearthed again. Farmers avoided plowing near them. A traveling journalist from the Kansas Star, Wendell Cray, came to investigate. He interviewed the widowed Eleanor Pike, now frail but sharp-minded, who had seen the riders years before. Her words, preserved in his notes, remain chilling. "You don't see them often, but you feel when they're near. It's like the air folds. They're not ghosts. They're something that learned how to live wrong." Cray dismissed it as folklore, yet before returning to Topeka, he requested one last photo. "Graph at the Bluff Creek Ridge. The camera jammed twice before capturing the shot. When developed, the negative revealed 3 blurred lines along the horizon, faint but distinct, like riders moving through a curtain of rain. The plate cracked in half within days. Elsewhere, the Dalton gang's official history underwent quiet revision. A university historian, Professor Harold Mertens, reviewed the Coffeyville evidence and noted discrepancies in the burial records. 2 coffins were registered under unknown male, with no family identification. Mertens's findings never made it to print. The college archives list his manuscript as withdrawn by author, though colleagues recalled he left his position soon after. By 1905, the Dalton story had settled into uneasy equilibrium, half myth, half warning. Travelers along the border still swore by an old custom. If thunder rolled without rain, you kept still. You neither spoke nor looked to the hills. Because that's when the Dalton sound was said to return. 3 slow hoofbeats in unison, fading just before the rain began. By 1906, the old Dalton country had begun to fade from the maps. New boundaries, new counties, and the slow sprawl of rail lines erased the old trails. Yet the stories lingered in ways that paper could not bury. Men who worked the land still found strange things beneath the soil. Bits of lead, a silver button stamped with a D, an earring half melted in fire. That spring a drought struck Barber County, cracking the ground and revealing the outlines of what appeared to be a foundation near the original Dalton crossing. When locals excavated, they uncovered a cellar lined with stone, its entrance sealed by planks charred on the inside. Inside lay 3 wooden stools, a rusted lantern, and the remains of a journal, mostly ash, but a few sentences legible in the margins. When it rains, we move south. When it stops, we bury what's left. The handwriting was never identified. Marshal Millen, still serving in Medicine Lodge, ordered the site reburied, claiming it was a vagrant's hideout from the war years. But his own assistant, Deputy Claremont, copied the journal lines into his notes. Years later, those same notes were compared with known Dalton gang documents. The slant of the script, the looping of certain letters, and the phrasing matched that of Grat Dalton's letters from 1891. In the absence of proof, rumor became history's proxy. Old-timers said the cellar was part of a forgotten ranch used as a meeting ground for fugitives who took the Dalton name as armor. Others whispered the original men themselves had returned to it, using aliases, growing older in the dust, appearing only when storms washed away their trails. A traveling doctor named Ephraim Gage kept a peculiar record from that same year. He wrote of tending a fevered man found near the county border, delirious and near death. He kept asking for his brothers, calling them by names long in graves. Said he'd been south too long, and the soil wouldn't let him rest. When I pressed for a name, he whispered, "Boone Dalton," and died. The record was filed under John Doe. By autumn, another letter reached the Topeka ledger, unsigned as before, the handwriting steady and neat. History chose its ending. We chose another. You will not find us in the ground, only in the storm. The editor dismissed it as a hoax, but the people of Medicine Lodge stopped calling the summer storms ordinary. They began to close their doors, not for weather, but for memory. It was around this time that a professor from the State University, Harold Mertens, the same historian who had once questioned the Dalton burials, returned to the region. His travel diary mentions a visit to Bluff Creek on October 9, 1906. Rain at dusk. Saw no one, but the smell of kerosene thickened the air. I believe this land keeps more than bones. He never published again. By 1907, the once bustling settlements near Bluff Creek had dwindled to scattered farms and ghost fences half swallowed by weeds. The Dalton legend no longer made headlines. It simply existed, passed in low voices across bar counters and campfires like weather. The older generation called it the storm curse. The younger ones called it nonsense. But no one stayed out when thunder rolled. That year, an itinerant surveyor, Lewis Brandt, filed a report for the Santa Fe Company, noting unnatural depressions along a section of abandoned line near the Kansas-Oklahoma border. He described 3 large sinkholes forming in nearly perfect alignment. When he measured their spacing, they matched the standard distance between telegraph poles, exactly 132 feet apart. Yet there were no poles left standing. Brandt's assistant, Martin Dole, sketched the site in pencil. On the back of his sketch, a short note. Heard voices during the storm. Sounded like men arguing below ground. The company archived the report and never acted on it. Later that summer, Deputy Claremont, now retired, gave a private interview to a local journalist. He recalled visiting the cellar years earlier, the one sealed beneath Bluff Creek. His recollection had changed with time. It wasn't just a hideout. There were markings on the stone, initials maybe, or dates. I remember one clear, 1895, scratched over and over again, like the hand that wrote it wanted to keep the year alive. He admitted burning his own notes that night. It felt like carrying someone else's curse, he said. Around the same time, a traveling preacher from Wichita, Reverend Whitlock, began holding evening services across the plains. His sermons warned of men who bargain with the rain. In one recorded homily he said, "The Lord buries sin in the ground, but these men dug it back up." Witnesses claimed the Reverend grew ill after a storm service near Kiowa, his skin burned by what he called light from beneath. He died within a week. By autumn, a few surviving ranch hands began to notice strange patterns burned into the prairie grass, circular, almost deliberate. One of them, Hector Miles, collected a patch of the soil and sent it to a university chemist. The analysis returned residual petroleum and silver nitrate. Both were used in 19th century photography, the kind employed to capture daguerreotypes. The finding reopened an old rumor that someone, perhaps one of the surviving Daltons, had carried a camera on the trail, documenting their hideouts, their crimes, maybe even their graves. No such photographs have ever surfaced, but locals still swear that when lightning flashes over the hills, it reveals faces for a split second, frozen like images half developed and fading back into the dark. By the close of 1907, even the skeptics grew quiet. The Dalton story had ceased to be a question of life or death. It had become a question of memory, what the land chose to remember and what it refused to release. In the spring of 1908, an unusually heavy storm flooded the lowlands south of Medicine Lodge, tearing open the same ground where the Bluff Creek cellar once stood. When the rain finally stopped, townsfolk found fragments of lumber and stone unearthed again, as though the land itself had tired of keeping its secrets. Among the debris lay a metal badge, corroded but legible, the remains of a deputy's star. Stamped faintly across its back were the initials H.A. The name matched Deputy Henry Alcott, who had vanished in 1896 after reporting the eerie Dalton signal. 2 short whistles, 1 long. His disappearance had never been solved. The badge, confirmed by aging sheriff records, reignited whispers that the Dalton story was not merely rumor but retribution, that those who looked too closely into the name somehow vanished into the same soil. A letter from Marshal Millen to the state attorney dated May 1908 references the discovery without elaboration. Recovered artifact at Bluff Creek site. Circumstances obscure. Recommend closure of remaining files. Continued inquiry only invites confusion. Still, the region would not rest. That same year, a new railway crew was contracted to reroute track through the valley. The foreman, Owen Laird, kept a daily log that survives in the archives of the Kansas Historical Society. One entry from June 11th stands out. Ground gave way under cart 3 miles east of Marker Post. Dugout wagon intact, half buried. Inside, 3 wooden crates marked machinery. Inside those, only dirt. Later he added, rain began at dusk. Workers heard hoofbeats. I told them it was echo from the bridge work. Still, they left by morning. By autumn, the construction was abandoned. Too many workers quit, claiming to hear voices in the culverts at night, reciting names none could spell. The Dalton gang history resurfaced once more in print, this time, too, through a research article by a young historian named Ethel Cormick, who tried to separate the myth from the facts. Her essay, Post-Coffeyville Sightings and the Persistence of Name, published in 1909, argued that the sightings were mass psychology born of guilt and memory. But she included one troubling footnote. Several objects attributed to the Dalton men, including their firearms and one engraved watch, show evidence of rehandling decades later. Whether replicas or recovered originals, they keep the names alive long after their owners should have perished. Within a month of the article's release, the Wichita press building that stored her drafts suffered a fire. No casualties, but all records of her field notes were lost. As the 1910s approached, the once clear lines between fact and folklore dissolved completely. The Dalton name became less an identity and more a sound, a pattern, a reminder. People stopped claiming to see the men themselves, yet they continued to speak of the Dalton weather, storms that rose fast, without warning, marked by 3 low claps of thunder spaced evenly apart. Even the old marshals began to speak softly about such things. As one retired lawman said before leaving the county for good, "You can lock up men, but not the noise they leave behind." By 1910, the Dalton story had drifted from lawmen's lips to the voices of those who remembered, farm wives, railroad men, and the children of those who had once lived in fear. Yet, though the name faded from headlines, the land refused to forget. Every spring, the rains came heavier, and each season seemed to bring something back to the surface. That March, a young postmaster named Robert Lacey was repairing the telegraph line along the old Kiowa Road when he uncovered a small metal box wedged in the mud. Inside were a pocket knife, a fragment of a silver watch face, and a brittle piece of paper bearing faint ink. The road remembers. The handwriting, again, matched samples of Grat Dalton's known letters. Experts disagreed, arguing that forgery was easy, but Lacey swore under oath that the paper had not been planted. "The ground gave it to me," he said at the inquest. "I didn't go digging for it." By midsummer, a research team from the University of Kansas, led by anthropologist Dr. T.C. Haven, arrived to investigate the so-called Dalton terrain, sites tied to the outlaw legend. Haven approached the task scientifically, mapping erosion, measuring soil shifts, and comparing rainfall charts to years of recorded sightings. His conclusion, though rational, was not comforting. Topography records trauma. The Bluff Creek Valley holds patterns inconsistent with natural weathering. It's as though something beneath moves when the soil is soft, then settles again when dry. When Haven returned a year later to continue his study, he found his original markers missing, each replaced by small wooden stakes carved crudely with the letters B, G, and R. Around that same time, the Topeka Daily Journal ran a feature titled "The Ghost Riders of Kansas." The article, citing the Dalton Gang's official chronicle, suggested that surviving relatives may have staged the later events to frighten settlers and control territory. Yet the story backfired. Locals refused to speak to reporters for months afterward. One editor later admitted that their office received 3 envelopes filled with dust and a single scrap of paper bearing the words, "Count them again." Elsewhere, ranchers began describing a strange phenomenon in the storm seasons. Fence posts would shift overnight, moving inches closer to the roads. In the morning, the dirt around them appeared freshly turned, the pattern neat and deliberate, 3 posts always disturbed at once. The phenomenon became so consistent that farmers stopped repairing those stretches, calling them Dalton Rows. The last surviving Dalton witness, Eleanor Pike, by then living in Wichita, gave her final interview in 1911. When asked whether she believed the men still lived, she said quietly, "Not as you or I live, but they're not gone. They're caught between the storm and the ground. Maybe that's what sin does. It keeps digging." Within the year, she passed away. Her home was later struck by lightning during a mild rain, though no fire followed. The coroner's note on her death listed cause as natural failure of the heart. Locals called it something else, the last Dalton storm. By 1912, Bluff Creek had been formally abandoned, its remaining residents moved north toward safer land. Yet the soil there continued to heave after storms, as though the rain itself still carried weight. The new survey maps marked the valley simply as unstable ground. Few cared to ask what made it so. That summer, a federal land assessor named George A. Heller conducted the last official inspection of the area. His logbook, discovered years later among surplus government files, begins with clinical precision, barometric readings, soil density, terrain slope, but then shifts abruptly in tone. His later entries read like a confession. There are patterns in the erosion, symmetrical, human. At first I thought water or animals. Then I saw the handprints, deep, deliberate, as though pressed from beneath. Heller disappeared before his final report was filed. His horse was found tethered near a washout, still saddled, his belongings untouched. Only the logbook remained, retrieved from a hollow stump a quarter-mile away. Back east, in the academic journals of the day, the Dalton gang was safely framed as history, its violence recounted in moral tones. Professors called their story a lesson in greed. But among the people who had lived along the borders, that name wasn't a parable. It was a sound, a weather pattern, a rhythm that arrived with thunder. In 1913, an old telegraph operator named Earl Rowe, the same man who once recorded the mysterious Morse code message reading, "Never Coffeeville Again," gave a statement to a local reporter before his death. "It came again last month," he said. "Same pattern, same spacing, but there's no line running through here anymore. I tapped the key just once, and the reply came back. Still moving." The journalist never published the piece, claiming the transcript made the machines click on their own. That same year, a railway contractor uncovered remnants of a wagon buried along the new track path. Inside were rusted tin plates and 2 empty picture frames. The manifest tag still attached bore the initials J.D. When the objects were exposed to air, the wood began to flake into ash within hours. Those who studied the case later suggested the Dalton myth persisted because of guilt, the public's inability to reconcile how easily outlaws could vanish into ordinary land. But a few historians disagreed quietly. Professor Merton's private letters, discovered after his death, contained one sentence underlined 3 times. "Legends do not persist because they are remembered, but because they are not allowed to end." And so the Dalton story did not end. It lay dormant beneath the storms, shifting whenever men tried to document it, surfacing only when too much silence filled the plains. The people who inherited that country, railmen, ranchers, and homesteaders, learned one simple rule. When the thunder rolled 3 times, you went inside, you turned out the lamps, and you did not look toward Bluff Creek. Because by then, even the skeptics agreed, something out there was still counting. By 1914, the Bluff Creek region had almost vanished from new maps, replaced by blank prairie and the faint line of a discontinued railway. What had once been a frontier route was now a stretch of silence, a place where even birds avoided nesting. But memory, like moisture, has a way of seeping back through cracks. That spring, a traveling painter named Jonas Pell visited Medicine Lodge, hoping to capture what he called the ghost light of the plains. He spent a week sketching the storm fronts rolling over the empty fields. In his final diary entry, dated April 29th, he wrote, "There are 3 dark shapes that move faster than the rain, not clouds, too low, too sure of their direction. I've painted over them twice. They keep returning." When he exhibited his work later in Topeka, visitors remarked on the same unsettling detail. 3 faint silhouettes on the horizon, each facing the viewer directly. The painting, titled "The Riders South of Coffeeville," disappeared after its first showing. The gallery burned in 1915. In those years, the Dalton gang were still discussed occasionally in academic circles, always with the same conclusion, that they represented the end of the Old West. But in Kansas, their name lingered differently. It wasn't a relic. It was a rhythm. Train conductors spoke of a peculiar timing in the thunder along the southern line, 3 heavy rolls followed by silence. The Dalton cadence, they called it, as if the sky itself rode the old outlaw trail. A letter from Dr. T.C. Haven, the anthropologist who once mapped the valley's erosion, reached a colleague that same year. It read, "I've returned to Bluff Creek. The land has changed, but the air has memory. I found no structures, yet I swear I heard shovels under the soil after dark. There's no one left here to bury, yet the earth still works." He never wrote again. By 1916, the storms had grown erratic. Short bursts of violent rain, then long periods of eerie stillness. Locals said lightning struck the same patch of earth near Bluff Creek each season, never spreading, never igniting flame. A new sheriff, Daniel Rusk, tried to investigate. He took 3 men with him and camped near the old Dalton trailhead for a week. On the 5th night, a heavy downpour hit. When dawn came, the sheriff's tent was found collapsed, his men gone. Rusk's written statement, the last page of his field log, contained just one line: "They dig only when it rains." Afterward, the town stopped sending lawmen south. The valley became a blank on every new survey, marked only as floodplain. Those who settled nearby said it was more than that. It was where stories came to rest, only to rise again when the ground turned soft. By the war years, 1917 and beyond, Kansas moved on. But each spring, when thunder sounded in threes, even the modern folk, those who laughed at superstition, would pause, close their doors, and watch the sky. And somewhere between the first drop and the last roll of thunder, they would hear it. The faint ring of metal meeting earth. The last recorded mention of the Dalton storms came in 1919 from a government soil engineer named Edwin Tull, tasked with reassessing flood risk in the old Bluff Creek Basin. His report began in ordinary technical language: measurements, rainfall data, mineral composition. But near the end, his handwriting faltered. The final paragraph reads, "Soil remains disturbed in 3 symmetrical patterns. No signs of settlement, no animal activity. Night brings vibration in the ground, faint but rhythmic. I advise abandonment of further work." The report was filed and forgotten, buried in a drawer of the Department of the Interior. It was rediscovered only in the 1940s by an archivist who underlined that last sentence twice and wrote in the margin, "Still rhythmic?" By then, the valley had long gone silent. The grass reclaimed the wagon ruts, the river shifted its course, and Bluff Creek became only a name on brittle county plats. The few who remembered said the ground still heaved during certain storms, like something underneath, taking shallow breaths. In the final surviving local diary from that region, belonging to a farmer named Clarence Boone, a distant relative, some said, of the old marshal, one entry from April 2, 1919, captures the tone of what was left behind. "The sky broke over the creek tonight. 3 cracks of thunder, then stillness. The horses wouldn't move. I thought I saw figures by the fence, but maybe it was the lightning. I've locked the door. The wind smells like kerosene." And that is where the written record ends. No bodies were ever exhumed, no proof ever established that any Dalton survived Coffeyville, yet the pattern endured. Old-timers said that the plains themselves carried memory, that the ground beneath Kansas remembers not who lived or died, only who refused to be forgotten. In later years, historians tracing the Dalton gang would note that the border between history and haunting is often just a matter of paper, what's written and what's washed away. The Kansas rains washed much, but even today, when storm clouds gather low over the valley, locals speak of that peculiar rhythm: 3 rolls of thunder spaced evenly apart, followed by silence deep enough to feel. They say if you stand long enough in that silence, you can almost hear the shovels again, the slow, steady scraping beneath the soil, working not to bury, but to remember. And though the towns have gone and the lawmen long since turned to dust, the Dalton name still lingers there, whispered between wind and rain. No one claims to have seen them in decades, yet when the storms come heavy and the lamps flicker in distant farmhouses, a few still swear they glimpse 3 figures watching from the ridge, silent, unmoving, waiting for the thunder to call them home. The Bluff Creek remains, the storms still come, and the Dalton name is never spoken after dark,